Florida Gators fans, there was finally movement in the transfer portal as Lyndell Hudson Jr. You are a Florida Gator.
You are Locked On Gators, your daily podcast on the Florida Gators. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Locked On Gators, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked On Gators your first listen of the day. We are available daily and free wherever you listen to podcasts. Happy Monday. Happy Mother's Day, if there's any mothers that listen to this. I am Brandon Olson. Find me on Twitter at WNS_Brandon. Find my written work with Whole Nine Sports, Giants Country, NFL 33, and now we're going to talk a bit about Lyndell Hudson Jr., the offensive tackle that committed to Florida this weekend. We'll talk about how he fits into the team and what else Florida needs in the transfer portal. But first, we're just going to talk about Lyndell Hudson Jr. committing to the Florida Gators because finally there was some activity in the transfer portal for the Florida Gators on the offensive line because, of course, the only real traction before with an offensive lineman was from San Diego State in Josh Simmons, and he was scheduled to visit the Florida Gators. And before he even took that visit to Gainesville, he went on a visit to Ohio State, and while he was in Columbus, he committed to Ohio State, ended up canceling his visit with the Florida Gators, and it kind of felt like, okay, so this is just going to be a massively underwhelming transfer portal period for the Florida Gators. That is what it is. Now, you got in on the offensive line. So there's that. You've addressed that, which is arguably the biggest need going into the second transfer portal window. So you've addressed the offensive line. We'll talk about the fit in a bit, but I mean, Lyndell Hudson Jr. initially was committed to South Florida after entering the transfer portal from Florida International. So he was committed to USF after leaving FIU and decided to become a Florida Gator with that visit. And it kind of like there were whispers of it on Thursday and Friday. And then Saturday, it was like, okay, he might commit on Sunday or Monday. And then he just committed Saturday. So it was crazy. But it was also cool because Lyndell Hudson Jr., now a Florida Gator, you've addressed the offensive line need at least a little bit in this second transfer portal window, which is so important because as we were talking with Brandon Carroll on Friday's episode, you're like, look, like, you know, you should have had Josh Simmons. Like Florida was leading for Josh Simmons. He went to campus with Ohio State and he never came to Gainesville. And that really sucked. So you didn't get Josh Simmons. And then after that, it was kind of nothing really after that along the offensive line. Then you look at Lyndell Hudson Jr. and kind of came together rather quickly. Like I said, I will say he dealt with injuries in 2022. I believe it was mostly just his back that was an issue, which isn't fantastic, by the way. Offensive lineman not having a fully healthy back is not ideal. But I will say Lyndell Hudson Jr. dealt with injuries in 2022, dealt with back injuries. Not ideal for a team who dealt with injuries along the offensive line, specifically along the offensive line more than anywhere else this spring. Micah Mazuka dealt with injuries this spring. Kingsley Eguakin dealt with injuries this spring. Not the best kind of situation to be like, okay, yeah, well, our offensive line dealt with injuries, so we're going to add somebody who dealt with injuries last year. And that'll because, you know, no one ever gets injured 2 years in a row. Right, Gators fans. So that is the most, we'll say, perplexing thing about the addition for me is just Lyndell Hudson. Like, yeah, you can be very good. You can be. But the best ability is availability. And, well, last season, Lyndell Hudson, he was available for a lot of it, but he also, when he was playing injured or he wasn't playing. And I will also say this, as far as the evaluation of Lyndell Hudson Jr., because we've heard so much about the evaluation of this second transfer portal window for the Florida Gators, where it's like, yeah, we didn't do much in the portal, like during the window, because we didn't want to send our guys out, but we were evaluating them. We just weren't recruiting very much. And evaluation has been a huge part. And evaluation has been something where I'm just like, hey, if this coaching staff is like, we're evaluating this, then I trust you because you know more than I do. You're better than I am at it. And like I said, like I know someone who used to work with Billy Napier, and he was like, man, Napier's evaluation is like no other coach I've been around. He's like, he writes full length paragraphs and paragraphs of scouting reports. And I haven't met a single other coach that does that. Usually they just write, bullet point, and that's it. But Napier writes full length scouting reports. That's one of the reasons where, I mean, I feel like even if the classes aren't super high ranked, I'm like, okay, like Napier's getting good talent though. That's my thing is I don't care what the ranking sites say. I care about the evaluation of the Power 5 SEC coach that's done it for years. So that's what I care about. But as far as his evaluation goes for Lyndell Hudson Jr., I'm curious, and I don't think we'll ever get the answer for this, but I'm curious to know if anything with Austin Armstrong came into effect here or came into play here, because Austin Armstrong was the defensive coordinator at Southern Miss for the past 2 seasons, in 2021 and 2022. He was the DC at Southern Miss. In 2021, Lyndell Hudson Jr., in the last game of the year, played against Southern Miss. That was the only time he played Southern Miss while Austin Armstrong was the defensive coordinator, because again, Lyndell Hudson Jr. dealt with injuries last season. But the 2021 was the only time that Austin Armstrong and Lyndell Hudson Jr. played each other. It was when Lyndell Hudson Jr. played against Southern Miss. And so I'm curious to know if that game from Lyndell Hudson Jr. had any impact on this. Like if Austin Armstrong was just like, yeah, that right side gave us issues last time, like, or whatever it might be. It could be nothing. It could be overlooking this or over evaluating this. But I'm just curious if anything came into play of Austin Armstrong going like, yeah, I have experience going against this guy. He's solid. Like he gave up a sack when we played, but that was when we blitzed or whatever. So I'm just curious if that went into a play, just because I like to know those things that are just like the subtle intricacies that very well could not matter at all, but might. But we are about to talk about how Lyndell Hudson Jr. actually fits in with this Florida Gators team and this Florida Gators offense. But first, today's episode of Locked On Gators is brought to you by Built Bar. Halfway point in May, just letting you know. Halfway point. We are a couple weeks away from Memorial Day weekend, which is like pools open, everything opens up, at least where I'm from. That's the weekend where we're all like, let's go nuts. But if you're trying to get in shape for that and trying to maintain it afterwards for the rest of the summer, add Built Bar into your diet, into your plan, whatever you want to call it. Because I don't like to say diet because it's just, that sounds way too restrictive. But it's coated in 100% chocolate. So if you have a sweet tooth like I very much do, then you get that fix there. Most bars have just 130 calories, 4 net carbs, 17 grams of protein, and they're finally in stores. So go to built or builtbar.com, go to your local Walmart or Sam's Club and get yourself that Built Bar. Thanks again for making Locked On Gators your first listen of the day. We are available daily and free wherever you listen to podcasts. Please do make sure to like, subscribe, comment, review, join the Locked On Gators Discord. The link is in the description below, whether you're listening to this or watching on YouTube. We have some fun in there. But now we're talking about Lyndell Hudson Jr. and how he fits into this Florida Gators team. I will say this just like off the bat, I'm not really sure that Lyndell Hudson Jr. is a starter quality player for the Florida Gators. And by starter quality, I don't mean that he can't start for the Gators. I mean that across FBS Power 5 football, we'll say, across Power 5 football, he is not average starter or better. That's what I mean when I say starter quality. Like if you're a below average starter, I don't care that you're like you're not keeping me from upgrading the position is my point. It's kind of like when you have, if you're an NFL fan, you have like an average quarterback and you're like, yeah, like he's solid, but like can he get us over the hump? And it's like, probably not. Then it's not awesome. Jared Goff. So like that, That's what I mean. Where it's like he's not horrible. I just don't think he's an average to above average or great starting offensive tackle for the Florida Gators. But I will say that at the absolute worst, he gives you a swing tackle that can rotate in if he's needed. And Florida, we know, rotates their offensive linemen. So he could rotate in if he's needed. He could probably spot start. And that's also the thing where I say I'm not sure if he's average to above average as a starter at the Power 5 level. That means he's a pretty damn good backup, I think. If I'm like, yeah, I don't know if he's average to above average as a starter. He might be below average as a starter. If below average starter is your primary backup, that's pretty comfortable, I think. At least in my opinion, I'm like, hey, if we have 3 starter quality tackles or 3, we'll say 2 average to above average starter tackles and then 1 that's all right, and he could be a swing tackle, that's awesome then. Like to me, that makes me very comfortable with tackle, especially when you add in Damian George to that, because I'm assuming it's going to be Austin Barber and Keontae Goodwin starting at the tackle spots for the Florida Gators this fall. Lyndell Hudson Jr. has played mostly right tackle, but he has played a little bit of left tackle. I think it's like, I think he had like 1,000 snaps at right tackle and like 150 at left tackle. So not a ton of experience there, but maybe he's just more comfortable on the right side. Maybe FIU was just more comfortable with who they had on the left side. Could be a million things. And it's also important to note that it's not as stark a difference in value as it used to be when you go, oh, this guy's a left tackle, so he's better than the right tackle. That's not really how it works anymore. Now you're like, okay, well, we need 2 good tackles. Doesn't matter if you're left or right. We need 2 good tackles to protect both sides because there's so many talented edge rushers in football now. So, yeah, I don't think it matters so much, but I will say that he's played mostly right, has played a little bit of left. That's versatility there for me. And if you're a depth offensive lineman and you could play multiple spots, that adds a ton of value to your game. So great for him. As far as actually fitting onto the field with this team, Florida International FIU is a very heavy zone blocking offense. They go a lot of zone, whether it's inside zone or outside zone, a lot of zone blocking in this offense in the running game. That's fantastic for this because Billy Napier, last year they had a pretty solid mix of zone versus gap blocking. I think that was a result of the personnel you had on the team, not necessarily what Billy Napier wants to do. I think Billy Napier wants to go even more zone blocking than he did last year. So if you have that opportunity to do that, and if you can get players on your team that can fit that system and do that, then you do that. So I think that adding Lyndell Hudson Jr. gives you a little bit of that versatility and a little bit of that zone blocking system and adds a bit into the zone blocking game there. And he can immediately come in and be a actual contributor if he needs to be, especially, again, whether or not he starts, his ability to play both left and right tackle is there. And that's an important part to add, especially in the second transfer portal window where we've been talking about not as much talent hit the second portal window as we were expecting for or as we were hoping for. So to add Lyndell Hudson Jr., big W right there. As far as pass protection goes, I think that's where Lyndell Hudson Jr. is better. I think he's better in pass protection than he is in run blocking. Not that he's a bad run blocker at all. I think he's better in pass protection. I think his technique looks a lot better in pass protection, where when you watch him in zone blocking or in run blocking, which is mostly zone blocking, but when you watch him in run blocking, it's kind of one of those times where like he's just bigger and better than a lot of the guys he's going against, because even when he played against Texas Tech in 2021, which is one of the games that I watched of him since he committed, when he played against Texas Tech in 2021, Tyree Wilson was on that defensive line, the 7th overall pick to the Raiders in the draft this year. But Tyree Wilson was playing on the opposite side of the line for the huge majority of that game. So he didn't really get to go against Tyree Wilson frequently. Instead, he was going against, I don't even know who the other dude was for Texas Tech, but I know that, hey, he's not Tyree Wilson. So it's things like that where even when he did play Power 5 opponents, he wasn't often going against a great Power 5 player or a great Power 5 edge defender or defensive lineman. So when you did see him, he was dominating, Charlotte, the LIU Sharks. Like, he wasn't playing against awesome players and dominating them. He was kind of beating the crap out of worse competition. And so that's why I think run blocking, not as technically savvy, but I do think in pass protection he's pretty solid. I genuinely do think. I think his technique in pass protection was pretty good. I think he's a solid anchor, solid base, which is why the back does worry me a little bit, because when you're anchoring in, if your back is jacked, then congrats. So is your pass protection. So I think that we and Jack isn't bad, like hurt. Then so is your pass protection. So I think that we need to kind of see how healthy he is. But as far as pass protection goes, I'm very comfortable with him. It's the run blocking here where I'm like, well, I don't know if he's going to translate to the SEC, because the question with Osiris Torrance was the same thing. But Osiris Torrance, you can see, was technically sound as a run blocker and an absolute beast power-wise. I don't think Lyndell Hudson Jr. is an absolute beast power-wise. I just think he was more powerful than who you win against. But now we're looking at what the Florida Gators still need to do in the transfer portal, because you've still got a couple of scholarship spots available. I still think the biggest area that I would want the Florida Gators to add offensively is receiver. It's just, and it's not even that I'm like, oh, receiver is so bad this year. It's not great. It's fairly inexperienced. But my thing is, I feel like a lot of all the positions that got an influx of talent in the second transfer portal window, I feel like receiver is like the position there. Like, I get it. A lot of us aren't super high on Xavier Henderson. He hit the portal. He's a pretty good football player. Zachary Franklin hit the portal. Pretty good football player. Montana Limonius Craig hit the portal. Pretty good football player. Keon Coleman hit the portal. Pretty good football player. So I think receiver just had so much talent, hit the portal. It's a position where you don't have a ton of experience, and you could add some bodies that can contribute to the outside. I think that still, for me, is the number one thing I'd like to see Florida address in the portal. I will also say that I think giving the scholarship to Khalil Jackson makes me feel like they're not going to add a receiver in the portal, because I feel like the approach that Billy Napier has taken is, we're going to add another scholarship QB. We're going to add another scholarship player at this position. By giving Khalil Jackson that scholarship, you added a scholarship receiver as far as that goes, which may be flawed logic, but it's still what I think is going on there, where you've now invested a scholarship in receiver. That's what you did. Whether you brought an outside receiver with a scholarship or internally, which they did internally, I think for them, they're like, okay, we invested a scholarship in receiver. We're done there. So I think that adding Khalil Jackson, it also shows a lot of confidence in Khalil Jackson, by the way, to add the scholarship there. So I think that's like, all right, you knocked that one out. You got your receiver done, which, again, disagree with. I think that you should add another receiver, but whatever. I'm not a coach here. Defensively, I think boundary corner is the spot that you have to go. I understand. No, I guess understand, but disagree with moving Jaden Hill to star. Nothing against Jaden Hill. I think that his eyes are great. If his knee is good, then he's good. But he is someone who, last year, I get it. He had a few great picks. He made a few great plays. He also had a lot of really bad plays. And that's my thing, where it's like, I think it was his knee. I feel like his knee really limited him. He had the setback. If he's good to go now and truly like 100% healthy, great. Try him at star. But that also means that you take him off the boundary, where he was pretty good, and especially when you're going to go more cover 3, he probably would have been even better this year, and you're putting him at star. So he's not going to have those opportunities as much. So there's that. But I will say, yes, great for him if it works out. But again, on the boundary, that means that you've got really just a ton of youth. Inexperience is another position where you've got a ton of inexperience at the spot, and you could probably use some help. So if there's a boundary option available, that you're comfortable with saying, hey, you can come in and compete for a starting spot immediately, bring him in. But again, I feel like there hasn't been a ton of starter quality corners that hit the transfer portal this year. This is the opposite of receiver, where receiver had plenty of guys hit the portal. Boundary corner, I feel like there haven't been many. If you could get that, awesome. But if not, then you have to rely on the young guys, the Devin Moores, the Jakeem Jacksons to step up. You have to hope Jalen Kimber can step up, who Jalen Kimber had some pretty bright spots last year. He's also had some pretty negative spots. So you have to hope that Jalen Kimber can step up and be the guy for you coming in. So I think that it's a lot of projection, but it's also one of those times where we're not expecting or projecting players to fill in at multiple spots. We're projecting, 4 players, and one of them has to be a good starter quality corner on the outside. So there's that where you can go, okay, like maybe you don't need to address it. And you probably could, probably should, but you don't need to address it in the transfer portal. It's just still what I would do. Because again, you have Jason Marshall on one side and you're pretty comfortable with that. But now it's between all the other guys. Ethan Pouncey, does he step up? Jakeem Jackson, does he step up? Devin Moore, Jalen Kimber, who steps up to be the actual guy opposite? Because I know everybody loves Devin Moore. I love him too. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend that he was a superstar last year. He was good for a freshman. That's an important distinction in that. He was good for a freshman. But the distinction is now the expectation is to be good, period. Not good for a freshman. That's the big difference now. You could also go elsewhere where you can add edge, where you're also very inexperienced. You can add a young QB and you can kind of go, hey, 2024, it's open season. Whoever it is, it's open season. That's starting QB. You could add another running back like Alton McCaskill, who visited last week. And it's like, well, I don't care if we don't need a running back. It's a good football player that you're adding to your position room. Not just, oh yeah, we needed a running back. That's not it. It's adding good football players, because this is a talent acquisition business, as Billy Napier has said 1, 2, 3, 4, 500 times, I think it is. Talent acquisition business. He is acquiring talent, and that's what you have to do to compete and to stay great. Could it be tight end, where you've dealt with injuries for 2 years in a row now? I don't know what it is with the tight ends in Gainesville that they've been dealing with injuries for 2 years in a row. And they are also very young and inexperienced. So if you're looking at tight end, I would say to add someone who has only a year or 2 of eligibility left, and they can be part of the rotation. That's why I was talking about Seydou Traore, where I was like, hey, like he's incredibly talented. I understand that there's some stuff with the coaching staff and him in Colorado. I need to get this through. Yes, there were disagreements between him and the Colorado coaching staff. Him and Tim Brewster, who used to be the Florida Gators head coach, they did get into it. Tim Brewster acknowledged, like, hey, he's incredibly frustrating because he's so talented, but he's just like, I got to get his head on right consistently. The issue isn't that he's a bad dude or anything. It's literally just that he's inconsistent and they're trying to get him to be great always. So yeah, add that to your room. Let him be great for a year. And then as a rotational player, he could be one of your starters. But as a rotational player, let him be great for a year. And then let him go to the NFL. And then you've got all the young guys who got experience this year as rotational players, the Arliss Boardinghams, the Hayden Hansons, the Tony Livingstons, the Andrew Savaianais, the Scott Isaacs. You add them in, and then in 2024, they're full go with whatever freshman you get for the 2024 recruiting class. So I think that, yeah, you could look at edge, QB, running back, tight end, receiver, boundary corner, maybe another interior defensive lineman, maybe even another offensive lineman. But there's a lot that you can add to this room with the remaining scholarship spots, or to this roster with the remaining scholarship spots. Thanks for making Locked On Gators your first listen of the day. Every day, we are available daily and free wherever you listen to the podcast. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Florida Gators football. For Locked On Gators, I'm Brandon Olson. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at WNS_Brandon. Find all my written work with Whole 9 Sports, Giants Country, NFL 33. And I will see you all tomorrow.